Sometimes, loving yourself will make you look like the villain in someone else's story, especially to the people who are comfortable with your silence. But not every disappointment is wrong. Some of it is simply the result of you no longer abandoning yourself to keep others at ease. Peace was never meant to come from being understood by everyone around you. It comes from finally standing with yourself, without guilt, without over-explaining, without needing others to agree with your boundaries. And the moment you stop chasing fairness from people who never gave it, something inside you begins to settle quietly, but deeply. This isn't about becoming distant or shutting your heart off from the world. It's about ending the constant tension of trying to make things work where they never truly did. Walking away without noise isn't weakness, it's awareness, the kind that recognizes when staying only creates more pain. And when you begin to love yourself in that way, your silence is no longer emptiness. It becomes strength, it becomes clarity, and slowly it becomes the freedom you were searching for all along. If you're trying to learn how to truly love yourself, these are a few things that begin to shift within you. 1. Loving yourself means you stop explaining yourself to people who refuse to understand you. Not everyone deserves access to your inner world. This realization is uncomfortable because a part of you still wants to be seen, still wants to be understood, but at the same time, you begin to see how much energy you have been losing trying to prove your truth. Because every time you over-explain, you are not just communicating, you are trying to make your reality acceptable to someone who may not even be open to it. And in that process, you slowly start disconnecting from yourself. You filter your thoughts, you second-guess your feelings, and you begin to shrink just to make things easier for others. And this is where loving yourself begins in a deeper way, not through loud actions, but through quiet decisions. You start to pause before explaining. You start to ask yourself whether this person is truly trying to understand you or if you are just trying to convince them. And that question changes everything because it helps you see where your energy is being wasted, and instead of continuing the same pattern, you begin to step back. At first, this silence feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because you are used to filling the gaps, used to clarifying everything. But over time, you realize that not everything needs to be explained, not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected, and not every person deserves that level of access to your inner world, because your thoughts, your emotions, your truth are not things you owe to everyone. They are things you share with people who are willing to respect them. As you begin to live this way, something inside you becomes calmer. You no longer feel the need to defend yourself constantly. You stop trying to control how others see you, and instead, you focus on staying true to yourself. And in that shift, you find a quiet kind of freedom, because loving yourself means understanding that your peace is more important than being understood. And once you truly accept that, you stop explaining yourself where it is not valued, and you start choosing yourself instead. 2. Real strength is knowing when to leave without noise. You don't need closure from people who gave you confusion. There is a moment that feels heavier than it looks, a moment where you realize that no matter how much you think about it, something still doesn't make sense. No matter how many times you replay the conversations or try to understand what went wrong, you are left with the same feeling, confusion. And for a long time you believe that clarity is something you just haven't reached yet. That maybe one more conversation, one more explanation, one more chance will finally give you the answers you need. So you hold on, not always because you want to, but because you feel like you need closure to move forward. You tell yourself that once everything is explained, once you understand why things happened the way they did, you will finally feel at peace. But what you slowly begin to notice is that the same place you are seeking clarity from is the place that created confusion in the first place. And that changes something inside you, because you start to see that not every person who confuses you has the ability to clarify things for you. And the more you chase answers from them, the more you stay stuck in the same loop of overthinking and emotional attachment. At some point, you begin to feel tired, not just of the situation, but of the constant mental effort it takes to make sense of something that never fully made sense. And this is where a quiet shift begins, not because everything becomes clear, but because you start to understand something deeper. If someone gave you confusion, they may never be able to give you closure, and waiting for them to do so only delays your own peace. This realization is not easy to accept because a part of you still wants answers, still wants a clean ending, still wants to understand what really happened. But loving yourself means recognizing when that desire is keeping you stuck. It means seeing that closure is not always something you receive from others. Sometimes it is something you create for yourself by deciding that you no longer need an explanation to move on. Real strength, then, is not in chasing one last conversation or trying to fix what is already broken. It is in knowing when to step away without needing to resolve everything, without needing to be understood, without needing to have the final word, because you understand that peace does not come from getting answers. It comes from letting go of the need for them. And when you begin to walk away in this way, quietly and without noise, something inside you starts to settle. You stop going back to the same thoughts. You stop waiting for clarity from someone who never gave it to you, and instead, you begin to trust your own experience, your own feelings, your own understanding of what happened, and that trust becomes your closure. You realize that you don't need them to explain anything for you to move forward. You don't need them to acknowledge your feelings for them to be valid, and you don't need a perfect ending to begin a new chapter, because closure is not something they give you, it is something you choose when you decide that your peace is more important than your questions. And that is where your real strength begins, not in holding on until everything makes sense, but in letting go even when it doesn't. 3. Your worth becomes internal, not something others confirm. Approval stops feeling necessary when you finally see yourself clearly. There is a stage in life where you begin to notice how much of your decisions, your emotions, and even your sense of identity are quietly influenced by how others respond to you. Not always in obvious ways, but in small, subtle patterns, like checking how something you said was received, wondering if you came across the right way, or feeling a shift in your mood depending on someone's approval or disapproval. And for a long time this feels normal because you have been taught, directly or indirectly, that validation is a sign of doing things right, that being accepted means you are on the right path. So, without realizing it, you begin to measure your worth through reactions, through feedback, through how others see you. At first, this may not seem harmful, but over time it creates a quiet dependency, because when your sense of worth is tied to external approval, it becomes unstable. It rises when you are praised and falls when you are questioned. And this constant fluctuation leaves you feeling uncertain, always adjusting, always trying to maintain a version of yourself that is acceptable. And in that process, you slowly lose clarity of who you are without those external reflections, because instead of looking inward, you are constantly looking outward for confirmation. But there comes a moment, often through discomfort or repeated experiences, where this pattern begins to feel exhausting, where you realize that no matter how much you try to be understood, liked, or accepted, it never feels complete, because there is always another opinion, another expectation, another standard to meet. And that is when a deeper awareness begins to form, one that shifts your attention away from how others see you and toward how you see yourself. This shift does not happen instantly. It happens gradually, through moments of reflection, through questioning your own patterns, through noticing how often you seek reassurance, instead of trusting your own judgment. And slowly, you begin to understand that the need for approval is not really about others. It is about a lack of internal clarity, because when you are unsure of yourself, you naturally look for confirmation outside. But when you begin to see yourself clearly, that need starts to fade. Seeing yourself clearly means understanding your intentions without needing someone else to validate them. It means recognizing your values and standing by them even when they are not supported by others. It means knowing what feels right for you without constantly needing reassurance. And this clarity creates a different kind of confidence, not the loud, performative kind, but a quiet, steady one that does not depend on external feedback. As this inner clarity grows, something shifts in the way you experience approval. It no longer feels necessary for your sense of worth. It becomes optional rather than essential. You may still appreciate it, but you no longer rely on it to feel okay. And this changes how you move through life. You stop overthinking how you are perceived. You stop adjusting yourself to fit expectations that don't align with you. And you begin to act from a place of self-understanding rather than external validation. This does not mean you become indifferent or disconnected. It means you become grounded. You still listen. You still consider others, but you are no longer defined by them. Your sense of worth becomes something you carry within, something stable, something that does not shift with every opinion or reaction. And in that stability, you find a kind of freedom, because you are no longer constantly trying to prove yourself. Over time, this way of being becomes natural. You begin to trust your decisions more. You become less affected by criticism, and you no longer feel the need to explain yourself just to be accepted, because you understand that your worth is not something that needs to be confirmed. It is something that already exists, independent of how others see you. And once you truly see yourself clearly, approval stops being something you chase and becomes something you can take or leave without losing your sense of self. Distance becomes clarity, not cruelty. Letting go doesn't make you cold, it makes you free. At some point, stepping back from someone or something begins to feel different than it once did, because earlier, distance often came with guilt, with overthinking, with the quiet fear that pulling away meant you were being harsh, uncaring, or even selfish. And for a long time, you may have stayed closer than you needed to, not because it felt right, but because leaving felt wrong, because somewhere inside, you associated distance with losing connection, with hurting others, or with becoming someone you didn't want to be. So instead of stepping back, you stayed, you tolerated, you adjusted, you gave more time, more energy, more understanding, hoping things would improve, hoping clarity would come while staying in the same space that kept confusing you. And even when something felt off, even when your peace was disturbed, you found ways to justify it, telling yourself that relationships require patience, that leaving too soon might mean giving up, that distance might be misinterpreted as indifference. But slowly, something begins to shift, not because the situation suddenly improves, but because you begin to notice how staying in the same place continues to affect you, how your energy feels heavier, how your thoughts become more restless, how your clarity starts to fade. And this awareness creates a quiet tension inside you, because now it's no longer about them. It's about how you feel within yourself when you remain where things no longer align. That's when distance starts to take on a new meaning, not as rejection, but as recognition. Recognition that something is no longer right for you, even if you cannot fully explain it, even if there is no dramatic reason, even if everything looks fine on the surface. And this kind of clarity does not come from overthinking. It comes from paying attention to how you feel when you are present in certain spaces or around certain people. Choosing distance in this way is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of honesty. Honesty with yourself about what feels right and what doesn't. And that honesty requires courage, because it asks you to trust your inner sense, even when it is not fully understood by others, even when it may be questioned or misunderstood. Letting go, then, is not about pushing people away or shutting down emotionally. It is about releasing what no longer supports your peace. It is about stepping out of spaces that drain you, instead of trying to fix them endlessly. And this process often feels uncomfortable at first, because it goes against the habit of holding on, of trying to make things work, of believing that effort alone can resolve everything. But over time, you begin to notice something important. Distance brings clarity in a way that closeness sometimes cannot. Because when you step back, you see things without the same emotional intensity, without the constant noise of interaction. And in that space, patterns become clearer, your own feelings become easier to understand, and what once felt confusing begins to make more sense. You start to see what you were overlooking, what you were tolerating, what you were hoping would change. And this clarity does not come with anger. It comes with understanding. Understanding that not everything is meant to stay, that not every connection is meant to last in the same form, and that holding on beyond a certain point only creates more discomfort. This is where the idea of becoming cold begins to dissolve, because what you are actually doing is not becoming distant from others, but becoming closer to yourself. You are choosing alignment over attachment, peace over pressure, and truth over obligation. And these choices may look like distance from the outside, but internally, they feel like freedom. Freedom from constantly overthinking interactions. Freedom from trying to maintain something that no longer feels natural. Freedom from the quiet tension of staying where you don't fully belong anymore. And this kind of freedom is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is calm, steady, and deeply relieving. As you continue to move in this direction, you become more comfortable with letting go. Not because it becomes easy, but because it becomes clear. You no longer see distance as something negative. You see it as a form of self-respect, a way of creating space for what truly aligns with you. And in that space, you begin to feel lighter, more grounded, more at ease within yourself. Letting go does not remove your ability to care. It simply changes how you express that care. You no longer hold on out of fear or obligation. You allow things to end when they need to, and in doing so, you create room for something more honest, more peaceful, and more aligned with who you are becoming. Distance, then, is not something to fear or avoid. It is something to understand, because when it comes from clarity, it is not a sign of losing connection. It is a sign of finding yourself, and in that process, you don't become cold, you become free. Peace becomes more important than being right. Some battles are lost the moment you choose to engage. You begin to notice how much energy is spent trying to prove a point, trying to be understood, trying to make someone else see things the way you see them. And in the moment, it feels justified. It feels necessary. Because when you believe you are right, something inside you wants to defend that truth, to correct misunderstandings, to make sure your perspective is not ignored or dismissed. And this urge can feel strong, almost automatic, as if staying silent would mean accepting something that isn't true. So you engage, you explain, you argue, you go back and forth, not always aggressively, but persistently, trying to bring clarity into a situation that feels distorted. And sometimes, even when your intentions are calm, the conversation still becomes heavy, tense, or draining, because the focus slowly shifts from understanding to winning, from connection to control, and, without realizing it, you become emotionally invested in the outcome, in being seen as right. But what often goes unnoticed in these moments is the cost of that engagement, not just in terms of time or words, but in terms of your inner state, because after certain conversations, Even if you have made your point clearly, you don't feel lighter, you feel unsettled. You replay what was said, you think about what you could have added, and instead of bringing peace, the interaction leaves a lingering noise in your mind. This is where a quiet realization begins to form, one that changes how you see these situations. Not every argument is worth having, not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected, and not every person is open to seeing things differently. And once you start to recognize this, you begin to understand something deeper. Some battles are lost the moment you choose to engage in them, not because you are wrong, but because the space itself is not designed for resolution. In certain situations, the more you try to explain, the more resistance you meet, the more you try to clarify, the more the conversation shifts away from understanding. And this is not always about the content of what is being said. It is about the dynamic, about whether the other person is truly open to listening or simply holding on to their own perspective. And when openness is missing, engagement becomes exhausting rather than meaningful. This is where your priorities begin to shift. Slowly but clearly, you start to value your peace more than your need to be right. And this is not about ignoring truth or avoiding difficult conversations. It is about recognizing where your energy is best invested and where it is not. It is about understanding that being right does not always bring peace, and that sometimes letting go of the need to prove something creates more clarity than continuing to argue. Choosing peace in these moments does not mean you agree with everything. It does not mean you accept what is incorrect. It simply means you no longer feel the need to engage in every situation where there is disagreement. You begin to observe instead of react, to listen without immediately responding, and to step back when you sense that the conversation is no longer constructive. At first, this can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because you are used to defending your position, used to explaining until things feel clear. But over time, you begin to notice the difference it makes. You feel less drained, less reactive, less pulled into unnecessary emotional tension, and this creates a sense of calm that was not there before. You also begin to understand that not every misunderstanding needs resolution in order for you to move forward. Some things can remain as they are without affecting your inner stability. And this understanding allows you to detach from the outcome of certain conversations. You no longer feel responsible for changing someone else's perspective. You simply express what feels true when it is appropriate and let go when it is not. This shift brings a different kind of strength, one that is not based on proving a point, but on knowing when to step away, when to remain silent, when to protect your energy instead of spending it. And this strength is quiet, but it is powerful, because it comes from clarity rather than reaction. Over time, choosing peace becomes more natural. You begin to recognize situations where engagement will only lead to more confusion or tension, and instead of getting pulled in, you pause, you reflect, and you choose not to participate in something that does not serve you. And this choice creates space for your mind to remain calm, for your energy to stay balanced, and for your focus to remain on what truly matters. Peace, then, is no longer something you hope to achieve after resolving everything. It becomes something you protect in the moment, something you prioritize over being right, over having the final word, over winning an argument. And in doing so, you begin to move through life differently, with more awareness, more intention, and less unnecessary conflict. And that is where the real shift happens, not in changing others, but in changing how you respond, because once you understand that some battles are not meant to be fought, you stop entering them, and in that decision, you don't lose anything. You gain something far more valuable, a sense of peace that is no longer dependent on being right. 6. Your circle gets smaller, but your mind gets lighter. Not everyone is meant to stay as you grow. That means growth changes you in ways that are not always visible from the outside. Your priorities shift, your tolerance changes, your awareness deepens, and things that once felt acceptable may no longer feel right, not because they are wrong, but because you have outgrown them. And this includes people, not in a negative sense, but in a natural one, because not everyone grows in the same direction, not everyone evolves at the same pace, and not every connection is meant to move forward with you. This is where the discomfort begins, because part of you still values the history, the memories, the familiarity, and letting go of that feels difficult. It can feel like you are losing something important, like you are becoming distant or disconnected. And there may even be moments where you question yourself, wondering if you are changing too much, if you are being too selective, or if you should try harder to maintain what once felt easy. But as you sit with these feelings, something becomes clearer. The discomfort is not coming from distance itself. It is coming from holding on to something that no longer aligns. And this realization shifts your perspective, because instead of seeing distance as loss, you begin to see it as adjustment, an adjustment to your current state, your current needs, and your current direction. Letting your circle become smaller is not about rejecting people. It is about recognizing where you feel at ease and where you don't. It is about understanding that connection should not feel like effort all the time, and that you don't need to maintain every relationship just because it existed before, because growth naturally filters what remains and what fades. As this process unfolds, you begin to notice something important. Your mind feels lighter, not because you have fewer people around you, but because you are no longer carrying the pressure to maintain connections that no longer feel natural. You are no longer adjusting your energy to fit into spaces that feel misaligned. And this creates a sense of relief that is subtle but deeply noticeable. You also begin to appreciate the quality of your connections more than the quantity. The relationships that remain feel more genuine, more balanced, more aligned with who you are now. And with these people, you don't feel the need to force conversations or explain yourself constantly. There is a sense of ease, a sense of understanding that doesn't require effort. This shift also changes how you view relationships in general. You stop seeing them as something that must be held onto at all costs, and start seeing them as something that evolves. Some stay, some fade, some transform, and all of it is part of the process, not something to resist, but something to accept. At first, having a smaller circle might feel unfamiliar, even a little uncomfortable, because it challenges the idea that more connections mean more support or belonging. But over time, you begin to understand that true connection is not about numbers. It is about alignment, and a few meaningful relationships can bring more peace than many shallow ones. You also become more comfortable with your own space. You no longer feel the need to constantly fill it with interaction. You begin to value your own company, your own thoughts, your own rhythm, and this strengthens your sense of self, because you are no longer relying on external presence to feel complete. As you continue to grow, this process becomes more natural. You stop holding on out of habit. You stop forcing connections out of obligation, and you allow things to shift as they need to. And in doing so, you create space. Space for relationships that truly align with you. Space for clarity. Space for peace. Your circle may become smaller, but what you gain in return is something far more valuable. A lighter mind, a clearer sense of self, and connections that feel real instead of maintained. And in that space, you realize that not everyone was meant to stay, and that is not a loss. It is a part of becoming who you are meant to be. 7. Silence becomes your default, not your escape. You no longer react to everything that disturbs you. At first, choosing silence can feel unusual, even uncomfortable, because you may associate silence with avoidance or suppression, as if not reacting means you are ignoring something important. But gradually, you begin to understand that this silence is different. It is not about avoiding what you feel, it is about choosing how you engage with it. It is a conscious decision rather than a passive withdrawal. This shift changes the way you experience situations. Because you are no longer immediately pulled into them, you begin to observe more and react less. You start to see patterns in how people behave, in how conversations unfold, and instead of getting caught in every moment, you allow things to pass without attaching yourself to them, and this creates a sense of calm that was not there before. You also begin to notice how much of your previous reactions came from habit rather than necessity. How often you engaged, not because it was meaningful, but because it felt expected. And as this awareness deepens, you start breaking that pattern. You stop responding out of impulse and begin responding with intention. And sometimes, that intention leads you to say nothing at all. Silence, in this way, becomes a form of clarity, not because you have nothing to say, but because you understand when saying something adds value, and when it only adds noise. You recognize that reacting to everything does not create control, it creates exhaustion. And by choosing silence in moments that don't require your response, you preserve your energy for what truly matters. This does not mean you become distant or indifferent, it means you become selective. You still speak when it is necessary, when something aligns with your values or requires your attention, but you no longer feel the need to engage in every situation that disturbs you, because you understand that disturbance does not always require action. As this becomes your natural way of being, you begin to feel more grounded, less reactive, less affected by external fluctuations, and this creates a stability within you that is not easily shaken, because your state is no longer dependent on what happens around you, but on how you choose to respond to it. Silence also changes how others perceive you, not in a way that you try to control, but in a way that naturally reflects your inner state. You become someone who is not easily pulled into unnecessary conflict, someone who does not react impulsively, and this quiet presence carries a kind of strength that does not need to be expressed loudly. Over time, you stop seeing silence as something you use to escape situations and start seeing it as your default state of clarity, a place you return to when things become noisy or overwhelming, and from that place, your responses become more thoughtful, more intentional, and more aligned with who you are. You no longer react to everything that disturbs you because you understand that your peace is not something to be constantly tested. It is something to be protected, and by choosing silence when it is needed, you create a space where your mind remains clear, your energy remains balanced, and your presence remains steady. And in that space, you realize that silence is not emptiness, it is control, it is awareness, and it is the quiet strength of knowing that not everything deserves your response. 8. Being alone starts to feel safe, not empty. You stop fearing your own company. For a long time, being alone can feel uncomfortable in ways that are hard to explain, not because solitude itself is painful, but because of what it brings to the surface, the quiet, the stillness, the absence of distraction, and in that space, thoughts become louder, emotions become clearer, and without anything to escape into, you are left with yourself, and that can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, especially if you have spent much of your time surrounded by noise, people, or constant engagement. In the beginning, this discomfort often gets misunderstood as loneliness, as if being alone automatically means something is missing, and because of that, there is a tendency to fill that space quickly, to reach out, to stay busy, to keep the mind occupied, anything that prevents you from sitting too long in that silence, because silence can feel like emptiness when you are not used to it. But slowly, something begins to change. Not because the external situation shifts, but because your relationship with that space starts to evolve. You begin to spend more time with yourself, not out of necessity, but out of choice, and in doing so, you start noticing that the discomfort you once felt was not caused by being alone, but by not being familiar with your own presence. As you stay in that space a little longer each time, you begin to understand your thoughts more clearly. You notice patterns. You become aware of how your mind moves, what it holds on to, what it avoids. And instead of trying to escape these observations, you begin to sit with them, not forcing anything to change, just allowing yourself to see what is there. And this creates a different kind of connection, one that is not dependent on anyone else. Gradually, the silence starts to feel less like emptiness and more like space. Space where you can think without interruption, where you can feel without pressure, where you can simply exist without needing to perform, explain, or adjust yourself. And this shift is subtle, but it changes everything, because now being alone is no longer something you avoid. It becomes something you understand. You also begin to notice how much of your previous discomfort came from the need to be externally engaged, from the habit of constantly seeking interaction or validation. And as that need starts to fade, you find a different kind of ease in your own company, one that does not rely on distraction or approval, but on familiarity and acceptance. This does not mean you stop valuing connection with others. It means your relationship with yourself becomes just as important. You no longer depend on others to fill your time or define your experience. You begin to enjoy your own presence, your own rhythm, your own way of being, and this creates a sense of stability that was not there before. As this comfort grows, fear begins to fade. The fear of being alone, the fear of silence, the fear of having nothing to do or no one to talk to, and in its place, a quiet confidence develops, one that comes from knowing that your own company is not something to escape from, but something you can rely on. You begin to see solitude differently, not as isolation, but as a space for clarity, for rest, for understanding yourself without outside influence. And in that space, your thoughts become clearer, your emotions settle, and your sense of self becomes stronger, because you are no longer constantly shaped by external interactions. Over time, this becomes your natural state. You no longer rush to fill every quiet moment. You no longer feel the need to always be surrounded by others, and you no longer interpret being alone as something negative. Instead, it becomes a place where you return to reset, to reflect, to reconnect with yourself. And in that shift, something important becomes clear. Being alone was never the problem. The discomfort came from not knowing how to be with yourself. And once you learn that, once you become familiar with your own presence, solitude transforms from something you feared into something that feels safe, steady, and even necessary. You stop fearing your own company because it no longer feels empty, it feels complete. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer looking outside to fill what you can hold within yourself. And from that place, being alone is no longer a condition to avoid. It becomes a quiet strength, a space where you can simply be without needing anything more. You let go of things without needing final answers. Not everything is meant to make sense. Some things are meant to end. This is where the struggle deepens, because the mind resists letting go of what it cannot explain. It feels incomplete, unfinished, and because of that, it keeps returning to the same thoughts, the same questions, the same why. And this cycle can feel endless, not because the situation is still active, but because your need for answers keeps it alive internally. At some point, though, a different kind of understanding begins to form, one that does not come from finding answers, but from recognizing their absence. You begin to see that the more you chase clarity, the more you stay connected to something that is already over, And that creates a quiet shift in perspective. You start to question whether closure really depends on understanding everything, or if it depends on something else entirely. That something else is acceptance, not of every detail, but of the fact that not everything will be clear, not everything will be explained, and not everything needs to be. And this acceptance does not come easily, because it asks you to release the need for certainty, to sit with what is unfinished without trying to fix it, and to allow something to end without fully understanding why it ended the way it did. Letting go in this way feels different. It is not forced, it is not rushed, it is a gradual release, a quiet decision to stop searching for answers that are not coming, and to stop expecting clarity from situations that were never clear to begin with. And in that decision, you begin to free yourself from the loop of overthinking. You start to realize that some endings are not meant to teach you through explanation, but through experience. They show you what you needed to see. Even if you cannot fully put it into words, they shift something inside you, even if you cannot trace every reason behind it. And this kind of understanding is not logical, it is intuitive. It comes from observing how something felt, rather than analyzing why it happened. As this awareness deepens, your relationship with endings begins to change. You stop seeing them as problems to solve and start seeing them as transitions to accept. And this removes a lot of the pressure you once placed on yourself to figure everything out, because you begin to trust that not knowing does not prevent you from moving forward. This trust creates space where your mind is no longer constantly revisiting the same questions, space where your energy is no longer tied to something that has already passed. And in that space, you begin to feel lighter, not because everything makes sense, but because you are no longer trying to make it. You also begin to understand that closure is not something that comes from having all the answers. It comes from your willingness to stop asking the questions, to stop seeking resolution where there is none, and to accept that some things end simply because they were not meant to continue. This does not mean you ignore what happened or pretend it didn't matter. It means you allow it to exist without needing to fully explain it. You acknowledge that it was part of your experience, that it had an impact, and that it has now reached its end, even if that end feels incomplete. Over time, this becomes a natural way of processing things. You no longer hold on to situations waiting for them to make sense. You allow them to pass. You allow them to remain unclear, and in doing so, you protect your peace from being constantly disturbed by the need for answers. Letting go without final answers becomes a form of strength, not because it is easy, but because it requires you to trust yourself more than your need for certainty, to trust that you can move forward even without full understanding, and that your peace does not depend on everything making sense. And in that realization, something shifts deeply. You stop holding on to things just because they are unresolved. You stop trying to complete what has already ended, and instead, you begin to accept that some things are not meant to make sense. They are simply meant to end, and once you allow that, letting go no longer feels incomplete, it feels natural. You choose calm over emotional chaos. Not every struggle is visible. Some of the most intense ones happen quietly, within your own mind, in moments when nothing is happening outside, yet something inside keeps pulling you backward, into old memories, old conversations, old emotions that once felt overwhelming. And even when you know those moments are over, the mind has a way of revisiting them, replaying what was said, what could have been said, what should have happened differently, and for a long time it feels automatic, almost uncontrollable, as if once the thought appears, you have no choice but to follow it. At first, you don't question this pattern. You assume it is just how the mind works, that revisiting the past is part of processing it, so you go along with it. You let the thoughts expand, you let the emotions return, and before you realize it, You are no longer just remembering something, you are reliving it, feeling the same tension, the same confusion, the same weight. And even though nothing new is happening, your inner state becomes disturbed, as if it is happening all over again. Over time, this cycle becomes exhausting, not because the memories themselves are new, but because the experience of them keeps repeating. And this is where a shift begins, not in the mind immediately, but in your awareness of it. You start to notice when the pull begins, when a thought tries to take you back, when an emotion tries to re-enter your present moment, and instead of getting lost in it right away, you pause, even if just slightly, and that pause creates a small but powerful space. Within that space, you begin to realize something important. The thought may appear, but following it is still a choice. Not an obvious choice at first, not an easy one, but a choice that becomes clearer the more you observe it. And this changes the way you respond, because instead of being carried away by every memory or emotion, you start to see them as something that arises and passes, rather than something you have to engage with. Choosing calm in this way does not mean the mind suddenly becomes silent. It does not mean thoughts stop appearing or emotions stop resurfacing. It simply means you stop giving them the same level of attention. You stop feeding them with more thinking, more analysis, more emotional energy, and instead, you allow them to exist without building a story around them. At first, this feels difficult because the mind is used to following these patterns, used to turning one thought into many, used to creating a chain of reactions that pulls you deeper into emotional chaos. But with practice, that pattern begins to weaken, not because you force it to stop, but because you no longer participate in it the same way. You begin to notice that calm is not something you wait for after everything settles. It is something you choose in the moment, even when the mind is active, even when emotions are present. And this choice becomes stronger over time, because each time you choose not to follow the pull, you reinforce a new way of responding. This daily choice creates a shift in how you experience yourself. You become less reactive, less overwhelmed by your own thoughts, and more aware of the space between what you feel and how you respond to it. And in that space, you find a kind of control that is not based on suppressing anything, but on understanding it. You also begin to see that emotional chaos is not always caused by what happens, but by how long you stay engaged with it internally, and by choosing not to extend those moments, not to keep replaying them, you reduce their impact. You allow them to pass more naturally, and this creates a sense of lightness that was not there before. Over time, this becomes your natural state. You still experience thoughts, memories, and emotions, but they no longer have the same hold on you. They come and go without pulling you into them, and this creates a steady sense of calm that is not dependent on circumstances, but on your relationship with your own mind. Choosing calm daily is not a one-time decision. It is something you return to again and again, especially in moments when it feels easier to fall back into old patterns. And each time you choose it, you strengthen your ability to remain present instead of being pulled into the past. And in that consistency, something deeper settles within you. You begin to trust that you don't have to follow every thought to understand it. You don't have to revisit every feeling to process it. And you don't have to engage with every memory to move forward, because calm is not found by controlling the mind. It is found by not getting lost in it. Even when your mind pulls you backward, you begin to recognize that you don't have to go with it. You can stay where you are, grounded in the present, aware of what is happening without being consumed by it. And in that awareness, you find a quiet strength, one that allows you to choose peace, not once, but every day. No matter how far you drift, you always come back to yourself. That return becomes your greatest strength. This drifting does not always come from something obvious. It can come from stress, from emotional overwhelm, from trying to manage too many things at once, or even from giving too much of your energy to others without taking the time to return to yourself. And when this happens, you may begin to feel scattered, uncertain, or slightly disconnected, as if something is missing, but you cannot clearly define what it is. In the past, these moments may have felt like failure, like you were losing control or moving backward. You may have judged yourself for not staying consistent, for not being as grounded as you wanted to be, and that judgment often made the disconnection feel heavier, because instead of gently returning, you became caught in frustration or self-criticism. But over time, a different understanding begins to form, one that changes how you see these moments. You begin to realize that drifting is part of being human, that losing your way temporarily does not mean you are lost permanently, and that what truly matters is not whether you drift, but whether you know how to return. This shift in perspective softens the way you respond to yourself. Instead of judging the distance, you start noticing the return. You become aware of the moment you realize you have been disconnected, the moment you pause, the moment you reflect, and that awareness itself becomes the first step back. Returning to yourself does not require a perfect plan or a dramatic reset. It often begins with something simple, a moment of stillness, a breath, a decision to slow down and listen inwardly. And as you do this, you begin to reconnect with your thoughts, your feelings, your sense of direction, not all at once, but gradually, in a way that feels natural rather than forced. With time, this process becomes familiar. You no longer fear drifting in the same way, because you trust your ability to come back. You understand that disconnection is temporary, and that your awareness will guide you back when you are ready to notice it. And this trust creates a sense of stability that is not dependent on always being perfectly aligned, but on knowing that alignment can be restored. You also begin to see that every time you return, you come back with more understanding, more awareness, more clarity than before, because each experience, even the ones where you felt lost, teaches you something about yourself, about what pulls you away, about what brings you back, and this learning deepens your connection with yourself over time. This is where your strength begins to grow, not from never drifting, but from always returning, because returning requires awareness, honesty, and patience. It requires you to pause, to acknowledge where you are, and to gently guide yourself back without force or judgment. And this process builds a quiet resilience, one that does not depend on perfection, but on consistency. As this becomes your natural rhythm, you stop seeing yourself as someone who needs to stay constantly in control, and start seeing yourself as someone who can navigate through different states and still find your way back. And this changes the way you experience challenges, because even when you feel overwhelmed or disconnected, there is a part of you that remains steady, a part that knows how to return. This return also strengthens your trust in yourself, because you are no longer relying on external structure to keep you grounded. You are building an internal sense of direction, one that guides you even when things feel unclear. And over time, this trust becomes one of the most stable parts of your life. You begin to understand that your connection with yourself is not something you either have or lose. It is something that moves, shifts, fades, and returns. And the more you accept this, the less you resist those shifts, and the more naturally you come back into alignment. No matter how far you drift, the path back remains, not because it is always easy, but because it is always available, and that availability becomes your strength, because it means you are never truly lost. You are only temporarily disconnected, and that disconnection always carries the possibility of return. And in that understanding, something settles within you. You stop fearing the distance, you stop judging the moments of disconnection, and you begin to focus on the return itself, because each time you come back to yourself, you reinforce something deeper than control. You reinforce trust, awareness, and resilience. That return, repeated over time, becomes your greatest strength, not because it keeps you from drifting, but because it reminds you that no matter what happens, you always have a way back to yourself. Your intuition becomes louder than noise. This shift changes how you approach situations. Instead of immediately asking others what they think, you start checking in with yourself first. You pause, you observe your own response. You notice how something feels rather than just how it looks. And this process may feel uncertain at first, because you are used to relying on external confirmation, but slowly, it begins to build a different kind of clarity, one that comes from within rather than outside. Trusting your inner signals does not mean ignoring all external input. It means no longer placing it above your own awareness. It means recognizing that while others can offer perspective, they do not experience things the way you do. They do not feel what you feel, and they do not carry the same internal responses. And, because of that, their opinions, while useful, cannot replace your own sense of direction. As you begin to trust this more, you notice how your intuition starts to guide you in subtle ways, through small feelings of comfort or discomfort, through a sense of ease or resistance, through an inner clarity that does not always come with logical explanation, but feels steady when you pay attention to it. And this guidance becomes more noticeable the more you choose to listen to it. You also begin to recognize how external noise can sometimes cloud this clarity, how too many opinions can create confusion instead of insight, how constantly seeking advice can distance you from your own perspective, and this awareness leads you to become more selective about what you listen to, not out of resistance, but out of understanding that too much input can drown out your own voice. Over time, your relationship with decision-making changes. You become less dependent on reassurance, less influenced by fluctuating opinions, and more grounded in your own understanding. And this does not make you rigid, it makes you centered, because you are no longer pulled in multiple directions by external noise. You have a stable reference point within yourself. This inner stability also reduces the fear of making the wrong choice, because you begin to trust that even if things don't go as expected, you will still be able to navigate them. You are no longer trying to guarantee perfect outcomes. You are focusing on making choices that feel true to you, and this shift creates a sense of calm that was not there before. As your intuition becomes clearer, it also becomes louder than the noise around you, not in a forceful way, but in a consistent one. It is the quiet knowing that remains steady, even when external opinions change, even when situations feel uncertain, and this consistency makes it easier to follow, because it feels reliable. You begin to understand that your intuition is not something separate from you. It is a part of your awareness, shaped by your experiences, your values, your understanding of yourself. And the more you trust it, the stronger it becomes, the clearer it feels, and the easier it is to recognize. In this process, something important shifts. You stop seeking permission to trust yourself. You stop waiting for others to confirm what you already feel, and you begin to move through life with a quiet confidence that does not need constant validation, because it is rooted in your own clarity. And from that place, outside opinions no longer carry the same weight. They become something you can consider without being controlled by, something you can listen to without losing your own direction, and this balance allows you to stay open without becoming uncertain. Your intuition then becomes your guide, not because it has all the answers, but because it keeps you connected to yourself. And in a world full of noise, that connection becomes one of the most valuable things you have, because it allows you to move forward with clarity, even when everything around you feels unclear. At some point, you begin to notice how often you adjust yourself just to keep things smooth, how you hold back your thoughts, soften your opinions, or ignore what you truly feel just to maintain a connection. And for a while, it feels necessary, because losing people feels harder than losing parts of yourself. But over time, that quiet shrinking creates a deeper discomfort, one that doesn't come from being alone, but from not being fully yourself. That's when something shifts. You realize that connection without alignment slowly drains you, no matter how familiar it feels, and staying where you cannot be real starts to feel heavier than walking away. Self-love, then, becomes choosing honesty over comfort, choosing truth over attachment, and understanding that being alone is not the same as being empty. You would rather sit in your own space, fully yourself, than stay in a place where you have to become less of who you are. Generally, you realize how much energy is spent going back to what has already happened, replaying decisions, questioning choices, and wishing things had turned out differently, as if thinking about it enough could somehow change it. For a long time, regret feels like something you have to carry, something that reminds you of what went wrong. But slowly, that weight begins to shift when you stop fighting the past and start understanding it, not to justify everything, but to see it clearly, to recognize who you were at that time, what you knew, what you felt, and why you chose the way you did. In that awareness, something softens, because you realize you were not trying to fail, you were trying to navigate with the understanding you had. Self-love, then, becomes allowing the past to exist without constantly reopening it, learning from it without living inside it, and letting regret lose its hold as understanding takes its place. Some days feel calm on the surface, yet your mind quietly drifts backward, revisiting old moments, old conversations, things you thought you had already moved past, and it can feel almost automatic, as if the mind is searching for something unfinished. For a long time, it's easy to follow those thoughts, to replay them, to sit in the emotions they bring, believing that going back might somehow bring clarity or relief. But self-love begins to show in a different way, not by stopping the thoughts completely, but by choosing not to follow them. You notice the pull, you feel the memory, but instead of getting lost in it, you return to the present, again and again. Choosing peace is not a one-time decision, it's something you practice daily, especially in small moments no one sees. And over time, each time you choose not to go back, the past loses its hold, and the present begins to feel lighter. It often begins in small ways, saying yes when you want to say no, staying quiet when something doesn't feel right, adjusting your needs just to keep someone else comfortable. And at first, it feels like care, like understanding, like maintaining connection. But over time, you begin to notice a quiet imbalance, where you are always the one bending, always the one compromising, always the one putting yourself aside. That's when it becomes clear that choosing others at the cost of yourself is not love, it's self-abandonment. You start to realize that a connection should not require you to lose your voice, your boundaries, or your sense of truth just to keep it. Self-love, then, becomes staying with yourself even when it's uncomfortable, even when it risks distance, and choosing not to disappear just to be accepted, because the moment you stop abandoning yourself, your relationships begin to reflect that truth. For a long time, it's easy to be harder on yourself than anyone else, replaying mistakes, holding on to guilt, and quietly punishing yourself for things you wish you had done differently, as if carrying that weight proves you've learned. But over time, that constant self-judgment doesn't help you grow, it only keeps you stuck in the same place. Forgiving yourself begins when you start seeing your past with honesty instead of harshness, when you recognize that you made choices with the awareness you had at the time, not with who you are now. It's not about ignoring what happened, but about understanding it without turning it into a permanent identity. Self-love means allowing yourself to move forward without dragging your past behind you, learning from it but not living inside it, and realizing that growth doesn't come from punishing yourself. It comes from giving yourself the same compassion you would offer to someone else. Many times, you may treat yourself with pressure instead of care, expecting constant strength, constant clarity, constant progress. And, when you fall short, the inner voice becomes critical, impatient, and demanding. It feels like pushing yourself is the only way to grow, but over time, that harshness creates more exhaustion than progress. Living gently with yourself begins when you start noticing that inner tone and choosing to soften it, allowing yourself to have slow days, uncertain moments, and emotions that don't need to be fixed immediately. You stop rushing your healing, stop forcing yourself to always be okay, and start giving yourself space to simply feel and rest. Self-love, then, becomes treating yourself with the same patience and understanding you offer others, knowing that growth does not need to be harsh to be real, and that being gentle with yourself is not weakness, it is wisdom. For a long time, you may try to hold on to things as they are, to people, moments, versions of yourself, hoping they stay unchanged, because familiarity feels safe. But life doesn't move that way. Everything shifts, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And resisting that change only creates tension within you. Accepting impermanence begins when you realize that change is not something going wrong, it is the natural movement of life. People evolve, situations transform, and even you are not the same person you once were, and instead of clinging to what was, you begin to allow what is. Self-love, then, becomes learning to flow with these changes without losing yourself in the process, letting go when something has reached its end, and trusting that just as things leave, new clarity and growth take their place. Emotions can feel like something that pulls you from one side to another, either fully attached or completely withdrawn, either overreacting or shutting down, and in those extremes, it's easy to lose your sense of stability. You may feel everything deeply, but without balance, those feelings begin to control your state instead of passing through it. Emotional balance begins when you stop trying to either hold on too tightly or push everything away, and instead learn to stay present with what you feel without becoming overwhelmed by it. You allow emotions to exist without turning them into reactions, without letting them define your actions or decisions. Self-love, then, becomes staying centered within yourself, feeling deeply but not losing control, responding instead of reacting, and understanding that strength is not found in extremes, but in the quiet space where awareness and calm meet. Inner stability begins when you stop relying on external conditions to feel okay and start building that steadiness within yourself. You learn to stay grounded even when things change, to hold your center even when emotions rise, and to trust yourself even when situations feel unclear. Self-love, then, becomes creating a sense of calm that is not easily shaken, a quiet strength that doesn't depend on outcomes or people, and a presence that remains steady, not because life is always stable, but because you are. Self-love is you move differently, quietly, clearly, and with self-respect. You don't announce your growth, you live it. Moving differently means you choose your responses carefully. You walk away from what disturbs your peace without making it a statement, and you carry yourself with a quiet clarity that doesn't need validation. People may notice the difference, but you are no longer doing it to be noticed. Self-love, then, becomes living in alignment with who you are without needing to broadcast it, allowing your growth to show through your presence, your boundaries, and your calm. Because real change doesn't need attention, it reveals itself naturally. In the end, Self-love is not a single realization or a moment that changes everything at once. It is a quiet, ongoing shift in the way you relate to yourself, the way you protect your energy, and the way you move through life with more awareness and less noise. It is found in the choices you make daily, in the moments where you choose peace over reaction, clarity over confusion, and yourself over the need to be understood by everyone. You begin to notice that you no longer chase what drains you, no longer hold on to what misaligns with you, and no longer explain yourself where you are not valued. Your circle may become smaller, your silence may become deeper, but within that space, something stronger takes root, a sense of calm, a sense of clarity, and a sense of self that is no longer dependent on anything outside of you. Self-love is not about becoming perfect or unshaken. It is about returning to yourself again and again, even after moments of doubt, even after drifting, and trusting that you will always find your way back. It is about living gently with yourself, accepting change, and allowing life to unfold without losing your center. And as this understanding deepens, walking away in silence no longer feels like loss. It feels like alignment. Choosing yourself no longer feels selfish. It feels necessary. And peace is no longer something you search for. It becomes something you carry within you. This is what self-love truly becomes, not something you say, but something you live, quietly, steadily, and completely.